I think a lot of people almost feel like I'm not allowed to have a voice for some reason, whether it's about a sense of I'm not valuable enough, I'm not worthy enough. And I think there's a key part of I'm worth it. So if you can at least stop and say, I won't necessarily have the best ideas or the right ideas or have all the bits and pieces together, because I think sometimes people think, well, if I had all of that, then I would know I was worthy.
Hi, everyone. This is Julie Gillespie, your host for the Conversations with Julie podcast. Safe place to come together to understand how conversations are and what connects us. Today's conversation with someone I consider a specialist, where we get to unpack the frameworks and models that hold conversations. In the podcast series, so in moving forward, what it's going to look like is I'm taking you along my journey of curiosity to uncover why conversations have become so difficult and how we can overcome the obstacles to connection. I'll be doing this type of conversation with other specialists, interspersed with people who've done the mental health first aid training, business leaders, and some personal reflection. So there'll be times where I come in and we'll just be having a conversation with each other about, these types of topics. Today's conversation, my specialist today is the fabulous Helen Palmer. Our purpose is to uncover how to create a safe space for important conversations. The conversation was so rich, we didn't want you to miss out on any of it. So we've made it into 2 episodes. And that'll be explained as we go through. You'll see why. Helen Palmer is the founder and author of Be Self Unlimited, a framework which we'll use to hold our space today while we dive into the topic of safety. We'll start unpacking areas of responsibility and how they directly relate to setting an internal safe space. I got that one highlighted. That's a really important kind of component to this. I'm so excited to share this episode with you. Thanks for joining us, and let's start a conversation that makes a difference. Thank you for joining me today, Helen. I am so super excited about this, and I know I always call you Helen Palmer. It's a 2-name thing between us, and that's my sign of respect and fangirling a little.
It's a pleasure to be here, Julie.
Look, and I've gotten to know you through working with you and developing my ideas and developing my concepts and having your voice in my head to push my ideas further and to find this expansiveness in my ideas and concepts and things like that. And so for me to have you here is really important to me because part of our ongoing conversations have always been in around safety, safe spaces. What does that look like? What does it feel like? In developing programs, in improving facilitation work that I do. Even it's gone into the training of, how do we establish these safe spaces? And that's kind of always been that point that keeps coming up. It's the theme, I guess, between us. And so to have this conversation with you and to have others understand what safety looks like and feels like, is, I think, brilliant for everyone to be able to hear our conversation around that. But I want to start and give people a little bit of background of why this is something that you know about and what's fueled our conversations. So I want to take people in. Helen's an author, an entrepreneur, a savvy businesswoman, in my world, someone that understands the complexity of the complexity and can fathom and work her way through what to us looks like a tangled knot of mess and, we just want to step away from. But in the work of being an author, Helen has a organization called Self Unlimited, which is the carrier of a number of ideas and a number of concepts and a number of frameworks. And one of those is Workscape. I love it because in my head, I've been working on Mindscape, which I've shared with you before, of what does this thing in my head look like? And I need to explain it. I need to take ownership of it. I need to furnish this with something. I need to understand going on. But you've done this for work. So can you give us a little bit of an idea of Workscape, what it is, just so the listeners can get a feel for it?
Probably helpful just to make the point that I'm intent on changing the conversation about work, given this is a podcast about conversations. So for me, part of that conversation reframing is about changing some language. So most people think about, I have a job and I have a workspace as a place where I go to work. And for me, that's felt too narrowing. It's felt like there's a bigger territory, a bigger expanse in which I exist and across the entire portion of my life, not just at this moment in time. So the word scape, we hear it in landscape and seascape. For me, it was about a workscape. So I think of it as a place that I can inhabit, a territory that I can claim for myself. And one of the key concepts about being self-unlimited is I'm the sovereign over that workscape and how I shape it. Now, there might be some people who are thinking, Judy just said Helen's an entrepreneur. This is going to be a conversation about running your own business. It's not. A key idea about self-unlimited is that you are self-employed regardless of who pays you. So that doesn't mean you have to go and be self-employed and run your own business. You may be an employee of an organization in whatever form that takes. Within that, though, often people think, I must do what the employer wants. My life is guided by my current employer. Whereas the notion of a workscape is more expansive and saying, well, actually, there are going to be many employers in your lifetime. So what does that look like for you on your side of the equation rather than their side of the equation? And you're going to have potentially many jobs across that workscape. You're also possibly doing many things singular, not in parallel, not singular, at the same time. You could be working for one organization while doing some volunteer work, while doing a little side hustle, something from a hobby point of view, the things that you're doing with your family. They're all work-like. Now, you're the only person who has that view of all of those. That organization doesn't. And so part of my desire to change the conversation is to say these words like job, career, employer, workspace are kind of problematic. So how about we change the conversation and talk about workscape?
So the language around those is nearly like the barrier, the limits that we place on these things, but also where we get to point at and go, this is the problem. Or this is why I can't do something, or, the set of rules I think are in place because of this, means I can't be all that I want to be.
Well, there's a lot of mental models that people have. There's often that mental model of, so what I do is I go to school, and there's plenty of things you can read where people say our notion of school was actually created as part of the Industrial Revolution to prepare people for work. But I go to school, I then get a job. Hopefully I get a good job. Maybe there was a tertiary education in there, maybe not. And then I progress through that job. And there's a point where maybe around 60, I stop working and then I retire. And I think that's such an outdated notion of the reality of people's lives. Often people have a sense like, so I'm supposed to know what I want to do when I have that first job, and I'm supposed to have a 5-year plan, and I'm supposed to have the sense of progression and all these measures of success. Yeah. For a lot of people, it's very anxiety raising because it's not the reality of what they see around them. And what I want to change the conversation to is there are many options available at any point in time, regardless of what's going on in history and in the background. But where you are now and what you hold as a mental model has been a product of some thinking of the 20th century. And in fact, this byline on my book is that it's a vocational adventure for the 21st century. So there's a notion that there is a period in time where maybe the conversation out there isn't happening fast enough or where you need it to go. So you can make the conversation for yourself, change the conversation for yourself.
The theme that I get from that and what keeps coming to my mind is, there's self-design.
Yes.
Because we do that in landscaping. We design the landscape to be self-sufficient, to coexist nicely together. We don't put palm trees next to cactus. It doesn't make sense. So there's this element of being able to understand what goes into it and making sense of it and designing what it's not just going to look like now, but how it's going to evolve.
Well, if you think about landscapes and seascapes, we as humans tend to put our very tool-like mentality and control over how those things are. They're going to change and shift and change and evolve without our control. So that notion also comes into the workscape, that our landscapes and seascapes, we have maybe some control over how we think they're going to be, but then stuff happens And then you have to live in that, inhabit that, orientate to that, and navigate to that. And you said about designing that, sustainability and some things like that. That's a version for a landscape. For some people, it might be that doesn't have any meaning to me. I'm into, if we were using the landscape metaphor, I'm into permaculture. Or actually, I'm into let it be what it's going to be. It can all go wild. And which brings me to one of the key ideas about being self-unlimited and having that workscape is you are the sovereign over that. And you have this responsibility called reign, where you get to decide my workscape will be one that is guided by these values of sustainability and whatever. So when you're talking about design, part of that design is knowing why I want it to be what I want it to be. And that might be, as much as I know right now, with the information I have around me, being open to the fact that the world is going to change, things are going to shift, and I will keep evolving that or shifting that however I want.
And so I just want to talk about reign, which is that sovereignty.
Yes.
Because to a lot of people, it's like our position of power.
Mm.
That power sense comes into play. And
yeah,
it's
absolutely.
like, power, and this is where reaction and kind of stuff comes in. What do you mean by it? I think it's really important for...
Yeah, there's a great quote that I will kick in with there. It's by a woman named Alice Walker, and she's the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any, which I think is so important when we're talking about work, because many people have a sense of employers have power. And there's a point where you're wanting to get a job. It's like, please, please, please give me a job. And then there's a sense of like, please keep me in this job. Don't make me unemployed or redundant. So there's a power dynamic already at play there where somebody once said it's, well, we're not masters and slaves because you're paid. But it's kind of like, well, maybe it's almost like feudal servant if we were to use that model. It's like you are still giving over power and choices to an employer. Maybe because you do no different. Maybe because that just feels it's the way to play the game and get along. And I want people to recognize that you actually have power. And by power, I mean here, you get to make some choices. You get to have a view. Now, an organization's going to serve its own interests. That's just right and normal. By the way, you have interests of your own. And, do you know what those are? And do you feel a level of comfort? And we get into conversations here about safety to actually say, I'm allowed to have them. And because it can be quite frightening to actually stop and think, well, if I want these things, then maybe I have to worry about whether I get them or not. And if I don't get them, do I get disappointed? So with power comes a sense of responsibility about, well, what consequences am I prepared to put up with? I just actually heard another podcast conversation before I came here today, and this person was talking about the fact that some people are happy to sit in certain misery where he'd prefer uncertainty to certain misery. And I think that's something that's actually guided my life. It's like I actually would be better with the uncertainty. So I use my power not to stay in certain misery and to say it's okay to have uncertainty. But in being in uncertainty, there are things that I will have to make choices about, but I accept that I have that power and I'm willing to use it to make those choices. They won't be the best choices or the great choices or the perfect choices, but I'm okay that I'm making those choices.
Hi, it's Julie here. I just wanted to take a quick break to say that I'm glad you're here with me. And it would mean the world to me if you could support the podcast by leaving a review or sharing it with someone that you want to start a conversation with. Now, back to the conversation. Okay, and I think this is a really great point to bring people into how do we connect into that. So what you're talking about is, the difference of sitting in uncertainty or certain misery. I don't think there's a lot of people that know that there's this bridge out of that or there's this way out of that and what that looks like. And for me personally, and why I wanted us to connect this into safety is that sense of safety, is that sense of external as well as internal safety. And I think this, I really want to kind of delve into, for someone to go into uncertainty, there needs to be a sense of internal safety.
Indeed.
What does that look like?
First of all, it starts with a simple, I'm worth it. So many of us, I'm having a goosebump moment, you too.
Me
which
too.
speaks to a lot of, when you hit on a moment in a conversation, but that's a side story, it's a comment for another day. But yeah, I think a lot of people almost feel like I'm not allowed to have a voice for some reason, whether it's about a sense of I'm not valuable enough, I'm not worthy enough. And I think there's a key part of I'm worth it. So if you can at least stop and say, I won't necessarily have the best ideas or the right ideas or have all the bits and pieces together, because I think sometimes people think, well, if I had all of that, then I would know I was worthy. Then
Waiting
I was
for the
know it's
perfect
valuable.
moment.
Yeah. And it's like, no, if I just said today, I'm worth it, which means that I'm worthy of actually considering my options and recognizing that I'm allowed to have options, and I have options that I never considered before. But also it comes with that sense of, and you mentioned the uncertainty and you mentioned the notion of risks. It's that I'm worth taking a risk on, even for myself. I think for a lot of people, there's a sense of like, well, if I was unworthy, then nobody would kind of try or push the boundaries or, to experiment and explore. Whereas for me, it's like those things can be risky, but you'll be more comfortable with considering that it's a risk if you have a basic sense of I'm worth it.
But those risks reduce when we have this sense of worth.
Indeed.
Because we're going to make decisions based on, you know what, I'm actually okay. I've messed up before and I've been able to resolve it. I've been able to resolve a lot of this stuff myself. These data points, right? Yeah. When things have stuffed up, I've not been yelled at. Someone stepped in and asked me if I needed help, and they helped me, and I didn't feel embarrassed by that. When we're at that point of I'm worth it, we sometimes need to look for those evidence points. But we're always looking externally.
Yes.
The safety points, the validation external to us to go, well, I'm worth to them, so therefore that must be true. So when we're looking at this sovereignty, looking at reign, looking at having the power over one's own scape, it's about that internalized, I am safe because I've got me.
The sovereignty idea comes that you get to declare some things. You have declarations over my reign. Now, the declarations for the reign of Julie Unlimited will be different than the declarations for Helen Unlimited, and that's perfectly fine. And one of the things in the Self-Unlimited framework is having a conversation about values and value. So one of the things I might declare is these are the things that are the values, and by values I mean the things that you believe, the truths that you hold as the inner truths that guide you. And I know for me, one of my strong values is integrity. And therefore that becomes a bit of a plumb line, and if that's a word people aren't used, I'm a builder's daughter, so it's something in the building trade. But a plumb line is something by which you align things to. So part of that sovereignty is saying, I have some values, I know what they are, and I understand how that might play out in the choices. Now, the fact is people already have these things, but they've never necessarily articulated them or named them and then necessarily used them or applied them. So, integrity is a value of mine in the sense of values. But it's also, and comes to this point when I said about am I worth it, we could also say I am valuable. So this notion of valuable is something has value. So that's a recognition. There is value that I have, and by here I'm probably better to say value elements. There is value I have. I hold value in the expertise that I have. I hold value in the time that I have. I hold value in the energy that I have. And so then a conversation about that's value that I have that I can use in other things to create value. And one of the notions of employment could be seen as, well, I make this exchange where an employer gives me money, that's valuable, and I give them time and expertise, that's valuable. Well, when you dig into that, for very few people is that the fullness of the value exchange that they actually want. So as a sovereign, it's then about saying, well, the value I want to put in and the value I want to get out is something, and do I know what that is? Because then that can help guide those choices. Now, I'm saying value here, separate from values, as in like value elements, which is something that can be very dynamic and very changing, which comes back to the role of sovereignty, because it's not, I made a decision today, it's this and that will be it for the rest of my life, I'm done.
So there's a dynamic.
Absolutely, yeah. In every situation that I come to, it might be, okay, I know I'm worth it. Okay, what's valuable that I have that I could contribute to something? Do I want to contribute that? Would that make me happy, joyful, whatever? Also, what value do I want this situation to create for myself and for others? And all of that is part of that exercise of power where you're, as a sovereign, you are saying, this is the declarations that I'm making for the sovereignty of Helen Unlimited. So right now, for me, part of the value, I've just moved to Brisbane. And there's an element where
Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I'm enjoying your tropical weather.
Sorry about that.
Well, it comes to the thing about, what I value is actually the opportunity to work with somebody, and we've both agreed that value we want to create for each other is fun and joy.
Mm.
And so as long as there's, and that we came up with a list, there's about 5 or 6, but fun and joy is at the top of the list. So there was an exchange of messages where I was experiencing the torrential rain in the past weekend, like, are you still happy that you made the move? And I'm like, yes, because I'm getting fun and joy. It wasn't about I needed physical safety or that I wanted to actually have an environment that was all, I don't want to say perfect, but all settled and comfortable and whatever. That's not what I've exchanged my life moving from to a new place for. That's not the value I'm wanting to create.
What that's just triggered in me in terms of, wait, hang on a second, is you weren't looking for those external safety elements. The top of your list was fun and joy. And being able to experience fun and joy let you know that you're safe.
Yeah. So I think when people are considering this notion of safety, it's incredibly subjective and personal.
Mm.
There are a lot of people who, when I talk about having arrived here, who want to say, oh, where are you going to live? And I go,
we had this conversation.
yes. And I go, I don't know. And they look a little bit perplexed and they're like, well, what is it that you want? And I go, I don't know. It is freaking people out that I don't know. I'm okay with not knowing. And so this partly comes back to the belief that, there's a practical element. I've got a husband who's packing up the house and cleaning it and got to get here in a few weeks' time.
Good move, by the way.
Thank you. And we will make that choice together about where we're going to live. But there's an element for me in the Helen Unlimited world view that I have as sovereign of Helen Unlimited is that uncertainty is okay, and therefore I'm prepared to take some risks and try some things without knowing. Now, there will be people listening to this like, no way. And that's okay, because I also recognize I don't have children to think about. I don't have elderly parents to think about. I'm at a certain age where there's a little bit of financial security, not a lot, but enough that enables, and the relationship with my husband, to have a conversation about, well, what are we prepared to risk? In fact, he actually said, we are moving to Brisbane because I cannot live with a bored, dissatisfied wife. So that says something about value.
Man.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, this is part of the concept of safety that trips a lot of people up. You know, when we're talking about safe spaces, and we create safe spaces in the room doing mental health first aid training, you know, we talk about not just what it looks like, because, you know, that kind of brings in this physical sense of I'm safe because I've got these things, these structures around me. But there's this sense of, well, what does it feel like? And a lot of people don't have an answer. Once we start playing with it and start pulling it apart, you know, we can start getting to an answer.
Yeah.
But it's something that a lot of people don't think about, because I think it sits in that value. Not values. A lot of people can tell me their values straight off the bat. They're practiced at that, but their value.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when we're talking about sovereignty, when we're talking about rain, we're talking about that self-understanding of what does it look like to feel safe, to then utilize my power.
Yeah. And some of that power is in very practical things. Like, as you were talking, it came to my mind, okay, what have I done in my physical environment that might be connected to my internal inside? And for example, I brought my pillow. Now, I need a good night's sleep. That's just something I know about me. I value a good night's sleep. I'm a person that, in terms of my energy levels, I need a good sort of 8 hours sleep. Now, that's a bit of a challenge with the sunlight at 5:30 in the morning here in Brisbane. Thank you very much. But I brought my pillow with me. So I'm staying in temporary accommodation. But I knew in my mind that something that's valuable to me is actually having a good night's sleep, which then actually speaks to how I deal with the day, where my emotions are at. And so it's kind of in some ways a bedrock physical aspect that enables other safety. So yeah, I brought my pillow. Now, some people might say, oh, so it's about the smell or nostalgia. It's like, no, there was a very functional need. But that was a choice for me. Other people are like, oh, no, I'll be fine with whatever pillow gets provided and the environment that I'm in. Yeah.
I have two. One for my head and one to kind of curl up on. Yeah. No, and they go, when we've got the car, they always go with us.
Yes.
We will sacrifice the children's soft toys. So I have my pillows. Yeah.
And I think there'll be things that some people might go, oh, she's making a big deal over a pillow. Well, that's okay. That clearly is not valuable to you, and that's whatever safety is. So I think safety and what creates a safe space, whether it's at the big conversation of a workscape or at the individual conversation of what I'm doing in a day, is incredibly subjective. And it comes down to, do you know what will either sustain you, what will support you, and what's right for you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for listening to the first part of this conversation. I have so many takeaways that I sat down with Emma, who you met in the previous podcast, and we went through, we re-listened to everything, and we kind of broke it apart to have a look at, what are these golden nuggets through the conversation. It started our own conversation, so we kind of went off into tangent land. It was fantastic. The biggest takeaway for me, though, and the one that I had a real visceral effect in the podcast that we recorded, was in being able to hear no from someone and say no. They're a big part of that safety element. It's so important to say no and set boundaries and to allow someone the opportunity for being helped in the way they need. I'm saying no because I can't help in the way that that person needs it. So it creates that opportunity for someone else to be able to be that support. The rest of our takeaways are in the show notes. You'll be able to find that on my website, along with articles and resources, both from myself and Helen Palmer. There's a great one in there about value exchange and saying no. And she'll have a specific article about this whole topic in there as well. So thank you for listening. I would really appreciate your support in leaving a review, but also to be able to forward this on to someone who you want to have a conversation with. So thank you. I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you.